Hey, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today we're going to be doing my reading survey for the year of 2023. This is one of my favorite videos to make at the end of every year. I've been making this video for so many years now. I'll have links down below for every single year that I've done this, but I really like doing these at the end of the year because I think it's a really interesting way to wrap up the year. This reading survey asks a lot of different questions about what was the longest and the shortest book that you read this year? Like, what was your favorite debut? What was books that lived up to the hype? Books that didn't? It's just like a lot of interesting questions that I think are really fun to go through. So without any further ado, let's just jump right into it. The first question is, how many books did you read in the year of 2023? And right now, I'm filming this still before Christmas, so I might read a few more books before the end of the year, but right now I'm sitting at about 215 reads for the whole year, which is a little bit less than I did last year. I think last year I was somewhere in like the 230 range, which is totally wild. I will be posting my stats video at the very end of the year that will have my final numbers, and that video is also going to include, like my stats for like my most read genre, which is actually the next question, is your most read genre of the year. I don't think it's any secret that my most popular genres that I read are thrillers, romances, and horror books. Like, those tend to be my top three every year, and this year is no different, that those are my top three. But for once, thriller is actually not my number one read category. It's actually right now between romance and horror, which is so wild to think about. So definitely tune in for my stats video a little bit later this month. Like, that should be the last video that I'm posting for this year to see the final numbers of like which genre was my most read, because it's crazy. The next question is, what is the longest and the shortest book that you read this year? The longest book that I read this year was Black River Orchard by Chuck Wendig, and this one comes in at around 640 pages. And I think a close second though for the longest book that I read this year would probably be Our Share of Night, which this one comes in at 588 pages. So this one probably would have taken the cake if I hadn't read Black River Orchard this year, but I'm really glad that both of these books were really enjoyable reads for me. And then the shortest book that I read this year was actually The Grown Up by Gillian Flynn, and this one was actually a reread, so I don't know if this one counts, but this one's only 62 pages. I think if I hadn't included this book as a reread, then the shortest book that I read this year would be It's Me, Charlie, which is about 68 pages as well, but we've talked about that book and I don't know her. And then the next question is going to be my favorite book that was published in the year of 2023. I'm definitely going to be spoiling my best books of the year video, so if you haven't seen that, I would recommend going and watching that one first, because I think my favorite book that was published this year had to be Shark Heart. I mean, it's got to be either this one or maybe The Writing Retreat, and I love the way that both of these have like some green on the cover, because I'm here for that. But Shark Heart is kind of like a literary fiction novel that follows this married couple who discovers that the husband is slowly going to be turning into a great white shark. The Writing Retreat is like my favorite thriller that I've read this year. A lot of people really hate The Writing Retreat, but I personally loved it so much. It felt like it was written just for me personally, and so these were definitely my favorite books that were published in the year of 2023. And then naturally the next question would be, what is your favorite book that you read this year for the first time that was not actually published this year? And that would be Any Man by Amber Tamblyn. This was my favorite book that I read this year, and I think this one was first published in the year of 2018. And then I also did read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and this one was also published, I want to say this one was published in 2019, but I read it for the first time this year and it instantly has become a new all-time favorite of mine. So both of these were definitely my favorites that I read this year that were not published this year. Next question is also your favorite debut of 2023, which again, I would pull both of these out because I am so shocked that both of these books are debut novels and they both landed in my top three of the year. Like, I think that is so impressive. I'm definitely going to be keeping my eyes on Emily Habeck as well as Julia Bartz. The next time that Julia Bartz drops another thriller, like, I am so excited and so here. But I also wanted to include Monstrilio on this list for like my favorite debut of this year, because this is another book that made it into my top 10 that's a debut novel. I think that's so exciting when I read a debut book from an author and just absolutely fall in love with it, so much to the point where I'll read anything this author writes, and that's definitely the case with all three of these authors. The next question is going to be a book that lived up to the hype for me. I think that's gotta be What Lies in the Woods by Kate Alice Marshall. Not that this book is getting like insanely overhyped or anything, but like I just went in hearing some good things. I heard that people were enjoying it. I was like, oh my god, is it gonna be for me or not? I don't know. And then it was my first ever 5-star pick for my own book club for the book troop, and that just made me so freaking happy. I like loved this book so much, and I definitely think it lives up to the hype for me personally. But also I would say Lessons in Chemistry is one that definitely lived up to the hype for me, because this is one that I read this book at the beginning of this year because it had won so many things at the Goodreads Choice Awards last year, and because it won like Barnes & Noble's like best book of the year or something. So I went into this book with some very high expectations, and I think this book definitely lived up to those expectations for me. This was the first 5-star book that I had this year, and I just really ended up loving this one. So I think this definitely lived up to that hype hype for me. And then the next question would be books that did not live up to the hype for you this year. I think I can for sure say that Fourth Wing did not live up to the hype. I mean, this is probably like the most hyped book I've seen on the internet in a really long time. And for me, this was just okay. I think it was like around a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Like, I didn't hate it, but I don't think it really lived up to the hype. And I think that's mainly due to the fact that I am not a fantasy reader. So like, this was not like, I was not the target audience for this book, but I just don't really think for me personally that this book lived up to the hype. But one that I was kind of also sad about is The Picture of Dorian Gray. This book is a classic that I read for the first time this year, and I really wanted to just absolutely love this because I always hear a lot of people speaking so highly of this classic, and while I'm not really a huge classic reader in general, I really thought that this one could be like the one for me, and unfortunately I just ended up thinking this was just okay as well. I think I gave this like 2 stars, maybe 2.5 stars. It was just very forgettable for me, and that makes me sad because I really thought this could be a new favorite. Like, I thought of out of all the classics, I thought this one would do it for me, but I'm just continuing to be not a classic girly, and so I just have to accept that about myself. But this was one that I was a little bit disappointed. I don't think it quite lived up to the hype for me personally. And then the next question says a book that felt like the biggest accomplishment, which I know you would automatically assume, right, that the longest books that I read this year were the books that were like the biggest accomplishment after finishing them, or it gave me the feeling of like, oh yes, I finally finished it. But I do think that Black River Orchard in a way felt like the biggest accomplishment of the year for me, not just because it was the longest book that I read this year, but also because, you know, I was talking about this in my Q&A video, how there was a period during this year where I really was not as motivated to read as I typically am. It was just like I was going through a drought, or like I was just going through this weird phase with reading where I wasn't as motivated and I wasn't as passionate about reading as I have been in past years. But then I really do credit this book to really starting to get me out of that and making me like fall back in love with reading. And this is a book that I read the entirety of these 600 pages with my eyeballs. Like, I didn't even rely on the audiobook one time. And I know you're probably like, well, that doesn't really mean much, but honestly, with the way that my brain works these days, I really do struggle through some books without the help of the audiobook these days, and I rely on the audiobooks so much to help me push through some like slower parts of the books. I just really, like, I've become a really big audiobook person in the last like year or two, and so the fact that I was able to read the longest book that I read this year entirely with my eyes without the help of the audiobook, I feel like that was a huge thing for me, and it did make me feel so accomplished after finishing this book. It was like, it reminded me why I love reading. I fell in love with reading all over again, and I just had a really beautiful moment after reading this book. So I really do credit this book to helping me with those things, and that felt very satisfying, and I felt very accomplished afterwards. All right, the next question is going to be your favorite character that you read about this year. This is a question that I kind of struggled with a little bit because I feel like even in some of my favorite books of the year, there wasn't necessarily like a character that I was obsessed with. Like, it was more so like the feeling that I got from the book and the writing in general. But I think one of my favorite characters I read this year was Elizabeth Zott from Lessons in Chemistry. To me, she definitely felt like one of those inspirational characters who felt so ahead of her time, you know, like she's giving me those like Jo March vibes or like the Evelyn Hugo vibes, like a woman who's working in science in the 1960s who was like making a real difference for, you know, women at that time. So I feel like Elizabeth Zott is definitely a standout character for me, but I also really loved the characters in Our Share of Night, specifically the protagonist Juan and then his son Gaspar. I feel like all of the characters in Our Share of Night were really strong, and they played a huge part in why I ended up loving this book as much as I did. And then I would also say the character Mia from Happiness Falls. She's the 20-year-old daughter in this book, and I just found her character to be really relatable, and I just connected with her. I loved her personality. I just thought she was really interesting, so she's definitely a standout character for me this year. And then the next question would be, who are your least favorite characters that you read this year? And that would probably have to be Wes and Ivy, like both of them from A Twisted Love Story. I found this book to be so repetitive and so obnoxious, and I didn't like either Wes or Ivy, and it's such a shame because those are two of my favorite names of all time. Like, I know that doesn't even matter, but like the name's Wes and the name's Ivy, like if I were the type of person to have children, I think I would consider naming my children Wes or Ivy. Like, I'm obsessed with those names, and like that's such a like little thing, like doesn't really matter, but I am so annoyed at the fact that I didn't like these characters as much as I did. Also, probably Ruth from Midnight is the Darkest Hour and Everett, like both of the characters in this book also just drove me absolutely nuts. These were the two books that I read for my own book club this year that were 1-star reads, and so these characters, I just felt like I spent some time with them because I finished these books and I was just not having a fun time. And then the next question is going to be the most shocking book or the most shocking moment that you had with the book this year. I think I would definitely say The Writing Retreat stands out to me as one of the most shocking reading experiences that I had this year, as well as Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Even though this one's not exactly a thriller, to me this book really reads like a thriller because of how obsessed I got with the story story and the pacing, it just really flew by so fast for me. But I also think there were so many things about this book that really shocked me. And mostly I think it had to do with how bold R.F. Kuang was with like talking about the publishing industry and like pointing out all of the issues. It was just such a bold book that really shocked me. And then also the ending of Natural Beauty is a book that I do think about very often. Like I think this book was shocking in every way. All right, the next question is your favorite couple or your biggest like OTP that you were shipping in your books this year. I think one of my favorite couples for sure that I was reading about this year was Jacob and Brianna from Yours Truly. Even though the second half of this book I got kind of annoyed with them, like the beginning, like the first half of this book is one of my favorite things that I've ever read in romance. Like they were literally so cute. And then I also really loved Logan and Maddie from Stars in Your Eyes, as well as Alexi and Ben from Something Wild and Wonderful. I also really enjoyed Clementine and Ewan from The 7-Year Slip. And if we're talking about manga, I think these two from Donuts Under a Crescent Moon were definitely one of my favorite couples. Like these two girls, oh my god, absolutely precious. Next question is going to be the best written book that I read this year. And I do think On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong is probably the best written book that I've read this year, because this book genuinely reads like poetry. I know that Ocean Vuong has actually published some poetry in the past, and I have actually read one of his poetry collections from last year, I think. And I really did like his poetry collection, but this book is so top tier to me in every way. And I think it's definitely the most beautifully written book that I read this year. I would also add Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake. I think this is also one of the most beautifully written books that I've read this year. This writing style was definitely a little tough at the beginning and it was hard to adjust to, but I ended up annotating it so much and just marking it up with my tabs because I think the writing itself ended up being so beautiful and the most memorable thing about this book to me. And there were just so many beautiful quotes talking about, you know, falling in love and like finding yourself and like dealing with mental illness and like all of these kinds of things. It was just so stunning the way this book was written. The next question is one that I think is funny because it's the book that you pushed the most people to read this year. I always feel awkward answering this question because I feel like you could tell me this more than I could even answer this because like I don't really know. But just based off of some things that I've heard, I do think At Home with the Horrors by Sammy Scott is a book that I think I pushed a lot of people to read this year. I mean, I read this book during Summerween and I just raved about it constantly during Summerween with how much I loved it. And I saw so many people afterwards reaching out saying that they read this book because of me, even so much to the point where the author himself actually reached out to me. I actually significantly boosted his book sales, which was such a huge thing, and like it was just such a cool thing to experience. And I actually even owe it to my friend Brittany because she's the only reason that I picked up this book in the first place. She was actually wanting to buddy read this book with me and I had never even heard of it. So I was like, yeah, like it sounds like a cool time, like maybe I'll just read it for Summerween. So thanks to my friend Brittany. We really should be crediting her for this because if it wasn't for her, I never would have read this to begin with. I would also say Any Man, I feel like is a book that I pushed a lot of people to read this year just because I read it all the way back in January and I've been raving about this book the entire year, and that's really awesome. I really hope more people do pick up this book because I loved it so much. Ooh, the next question is your favorite book cover from this entire year. I love this question so much because I'm a super shallow human who loves a good book cover. Like I'm definitely the kind of person who will be swayed to pick up a book or to not pick up a book if I'm not vibing with the cover. But some of my favorite book covers of the year definitely belong to The Haunting of Alejandra. Like, are you kidding me? I love the orange. I love all the flowers like that's on her head. Like it's just so stunning, so beautiful. I'm also kind of obsessed with the cover for The Fiction Writer. I just love the look of this. Like this is such an appealing cover to me. Like thriller wise, I would be so like immediately drawn to this because I love the cover of this. I know this one didn't publish this year, but I did read Yerba Buena for the first time this year and I really love this cover. Like I just think it's so simple but like so beautiful. Like there's something about this that I'm really drawn to. And then same with Shark Heart. Like I really do love this cover. I love the way that it's all of these like different flowers on the shark. There's something about it that's so simplistic but so stunning, and there's something about the greenish color this year that I'm just really drawn to apparently. All right, the next question is going to be your favorite adaptation that you saw this year and possibly read this year. I think by far my favorite book to screen adaptation that I read this year was Lessons in Chemistry. I read this book back in January and then the adaptation actually came out on Apple TV. That's like a show of this book. It came out in the month of October and the show stars Brie Larson as Elizabeth Zott, and I actually had a great time with the show. I feel like the show represented this book so well. Like it was such a solid adaptation and I would definitely recommend the show for anybody who is a fan of the book. Like I really think they captured the vibe perfectly, which made my heart happy. I also think even though I I didn't read Heartstopper this year, I did end up watching was it the second season of Heartstopper that came out this year? I did end up watching the show this year, and I really love the show. Like, I just continue to love the show. I think they're doing such amazing things with Heartstopper. I know the 5th volume of Heartstopper just published recently, and I haven't read that one yet, so I'm hoping I can make that happen soon. You know, I was really hoping that I could say the book Never Let Me Go would be like one of my favorite book to movie adaptations, but because I disliked the book as much as I did, I actually don't think that I have any interest in checking out the movie now, which is truly unfortunate. All right, the next question was, what book made you cry the most this year? I don't think it's any surprise at all that like my favorite book of the year is a book that made me cry the most this year, as well as Shark Heart. Like, they end up being some of my top favorites for a reason, you know, because I'm an emotional human. If I cry over a book, there's a good chance it's because I freaking loved it. And then also Yerba Buena was one that made me emotional this year, as well as Nestlings by Nat Cassidy, which is absolutely shocking. The fact that a horror book could bring me to tears in this way, like, there's a reason why this book made it into my top 5, and it's because it made me emotional and it was beautiful. And then the next question is, what book made you laugh the most? Which I do love this question because I think it's pretty rare that a book will actually make me laugh, but a book that made me like laugh and like just feel the most like giddy and excited this year was probably The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. I just thought these two were so cute, and I feel like there was a lot of moments in this book where they just made me like smile or like laugh to myself. Like, I just thought they were really cute. And then I would also say maybe Yellowface, more like laughing in terms of like, oh my gosh, this girl has the audacity, but just kind of like, oh my god, like kind of shocked laughing. All right, the next question is your favorite new author, which whether this is an author that you read for the first time this year or just an author that you really fell in love with this year. I feel like I do have a few different answers for this because I don't think there was very many authors that I was reading more than one book from this year. I was reading pretty sporadically, like I didn't have too much crossover with like reading from the same author, but I think Angie Kim is an author that I definitely fell in love with this year because even though I read Miracle Creek a few years ago, I think that one was around a 4-star for me. Like, I really liked it, but it wasn't a new favorite of mine. But after Happiness Falls, I feel like she has really solidified herself as like a new favorite of mine, and like I will read anything that this author comes out with now. And then same goes for Julia Bartz. Like, I cannot believe this is a debut thriller. I will be reading everything Julia Bartz writes in the future after how much I loved this. As well as Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. This is an author that I did read from last year. I read his first book, that was that book Mary, and I thought Mary was okay. I think I gave it around 3 stars, but honestly, after loving Nestlings as much as I did this year, Nat Cassidy has pushed himself to the top of like my favorite horror authors list, and I will be reading every single thing that he comes out with in the future because I really, really loved Nestlings. And then another debut author that I was really surprised by is Elizabeth Thomas, who wrote Catherine House. I know that this book gets a lot of shit and a lot of people don't really like it, but I personally really liked it. I loved the writing in this. The writing is just something that I really clicked with, and so I have got my eyes on Elizabeth Thomas. I can't wait to see what she could be publishing in the future. I feel like her books are definitely something I'm going to be interested in reading going forward, so like that's really exciting to have 4 new authors that I will be keeping my eyes on. Right, the next question is going to be your favorite reread of the year, and in this year I didn't get to reread too much, but I definitely reread a lot more this year than I did last year. I think my favorite rereading experience of the year had to be Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. This is officially my most reread book of all time. I think I read it for the 5th time this year, and I annotated this book like you would not believe this time around that I read it. I just went crazy and annotated it, and I had the time of my life, and it was really special for me to reread this year because the first year that I read this was back in 2014. Like, it was almost 10 years ago. That was like the first time that I read this book, and so the fact that this year was my 10-year high school reunion year, it just felt so special to like read a book that meant so much to me back when I was starting my first year of college, and it was just very nostalgic, and I love this book. I continue to love this book. I continue to relate to Kath all of the time. I love this book so much. Then I also very recently just reread Notes on an Execution and Any Man. I reread Any Man very recently because I wanted to confirm that it was my best book of the year, and it still was, and it just hit me just as hard as it did the second time reading this. But then also I reread Notes on an Execution for my book club this month for the book troop. We reread one of my favorite books that I read last year, and again, it was just as hard hitting as I remember it being. I cried while rereading this. I'm also currently rereading Project Hail Mary, and that has been an absolute blast so far. One of the last questions I like to tack onto this is the best nonfiction book that I read this year. I did not read a lot of nonfiction. Like, I only read 3 nonfiction books this year, but but some of my favorites that I read this year were The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. Like, I just had to mention it because this book was so amazing. I was a huge fan of Britney Spears growing up as a kid, and so this book just meant a lot to me to get to know more of like the behind the scenes of like her story of what she was going through. I thought it was really inspiring and just really well done. I think this book does such a great job of showing how poorly we treated women that were, you know, working in the pop industry and working in the music industry in these years. And I just feel a lot for Britney Spears, you know, like I feel like she was really honest and really vulnerable in this book, and it just meant a lot. But then also, of course, you know, like the BTS book Beyond the Story ended up coming out this summer, and as a fairly new-ish BTS fan, you know, like I became an ARMY BTS fan like last year in March. It's almost been about 2 years that I've been a fan now, but I just really appreciated this book for like giving me even more stories of like how they started as a group, and I just had so much fun. Like I had the time of my life annotating this book and tabbing it, and I even made a little like guide in the beginning for like what all the tabs mean, and every member of the group got their own tab. It was just so much fun. And then the last question that I like to talk about is the best manga that I read this year, because this was another year where I read a shit ton of manga. I want to say I've read close to 50. I don't know the exact numbers, and I will get into that in my stats video at the end of the year. But some of my favorite mangas that I've read this year include the PTSD Radio series. I finally finished the series, and it is one of the creepiest manga series that I've ever read. Like I honestly still think about this book series in the middle of the night and then I get scared. Like that's how effective it was for me. I also really loved the Alice in Borderland manga this year. I think I'm on volume 6 or volume 7 right now, but I've just been absolutely obsessed. I think if you like Squid Game or you like any kind of like deadly games where like people die and the stakes are so high, I think you would love Alice in Borderland. It's such a fun time. It's so well done, and it's actually so beautifully written. I also really love Orange. I'm still debating if Orange is like my favorite manga of all time. Like I just absolutely love it. It's very like coming of age, like, you know, kids in high school, and it's kind of sci-fi because it's about this young girl who starts receiving letters from herself from 10 years in the future, and she's trying to correct a certain thing that happened when she was in high school. She doesn't want to make the same mistakes, so she's getting letters from herself 10 years in the future. It's just so freaking cool, and I love it so much. And then most recently, I've absolutely loved Donuts Under a Crescent Moon. This is a romance manga series between these two girls, and there's only 4 volumes, and it was just so cute and so wholesome. It's never explicitly talked about, but I do think both of these characters would identify as either demisexual or asexual, and that representation in this just meant the world to me. I just really connected to both of these characters, and it was just so good. Highly recommend. So yeah, that completes the reading survey for the year of 2023. I still can't believe we are nearing the very end of this year. Like that is so wild to me. I love doing these videos so much at the end of every year, and I would love to know some of your answers to these questions. What were your favorite characters that you read about this year? What were books that lived up to the hype for you? What were books that didn't live up to the hype for you? I would love to know if you discovered any new favorite authors this year, or if you read any manga and you have any manga recommendations for me. I would also really appreciate that. And yeah, as I mentioned, I will have all of the previous years linked down below, so you can go and check those out if you want. And thank you so much for watching. As always, I really appreciate you for being here this year, and I can't wait for next year. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!